The Trap by Clay Fisher. Canady felt the horse beginning to go rough beneath him. He had been expecting it. On this rocky going, no man could make it that long as he had already ridden out on coming in that day. Easy, easy, he said to the laboring animal. It's only a posse. The horse seemed to understand the tone of the words, for it slowed and went better and steadier for a ways. We'll rest on the rise ahead, Canady said. I can see a few miles, and you can catch some wind, and we'll go on. We'll make it. He knew they wouldn't. He knew it before they came to the rise, and he got down and walked over to the overhanging spur of the gray-black basalt that gave a view down the canyon behind them for 10 miles. It wasn't a canyon, really, but a narrowing valley. The canyon proper lay before them. Canady grinned and wiped his streaming face. It was hot, and getting hotter. Pause, he said. They're pushing. I mean to take us. I must know the country ahead. They don't like to ride if they're in a hurry. The horse, now, did respond with its ears and turning its soft eyes as it had before. It stood, head down, blowing as though of distended nostrils. Canady came back and squatted down and put his hand below the nose of the horse. There was moisture of pained breath that would strike his palm. Damn, he said softly. Blood. He got his field glasses from the saddle pocket and examined the pursuers through them. 8, he said aloud. And 6 ropes. I wonder how come it is that they always fetch so many ropes. Never saw a posse yet that didn't feel that each of them ought to have a rope. His fingers went through his sunburned neck. He felt it tenderly, and he grinned again. Son of a gun, he said. It could happen. Canady's grins were not the only grimaces of a fool, but of a unfeeling man. They were the grins of a gambler, and of an outlaw, and a thief. Canady knew where he was and where he had been, most apparently where he was going. It did not frighten him. He would grin as they put the loop over his head. That was his kind. He wouldn't curse or revile, and he wouldn't pray. Not out loud, anyway. Us, he said. What do you think? The animal, slightly recovered, moved its ears and whispered it gruntingly. Canady nodded, turning his back to the approaching posse and Glassy to the country ahead. Me too, he said. The grunt and the whisker is all we've got worth. We haven't got no place to go. He tensed as he said it, the glasses freezing in an opening and the rearing base rock of the closing valley. It was to the right, a good horse, fresh and sound, could take a man up that gap in the cliff. A spill of detritus and the old ages of the fan of boulders and stunted pine that lay below its lip would permit the perilous mountain passage. There was water up there, too, for Canady could see the white ribbon of stream splashing down in the rainbow falls to mist before the lower rocks in a spume of red and yellow and turquoise-green lights, splendid with the beauty of early sun. I take it back, he said. Maybe we do have a place to go. Pretty, too, and handy to town. You can't beat that. Directly ahead was a level sunlit flat, dotted with tall pines and scrub juniper and house-sized boulders. A clear stream from the high hole in the right-side valley wall watered the flat, growing good mountain hay upon its sandy red loam, and making a ride across it a thing of pleasure to the hearts of many western men. Come on, said Canady to his horse. You canter me along the flat, and I'll climb up the land afoot, leaving you to pack up nothing but a saddle and a grub sack. Game? Least we can do is make those birds scratch the breakfast, and who knows? Our luck might change. We might get up there into a hole in the wall before they come up to rise and hear and spot us. If we can do that, there's a chance they'll ride on by up the valley, and we can double back tonight and make it free. He was talking to Canady now, not to the horse. It was the way men much alone when they needed to do some figuring. They would do it out loud, the way Canady was doing. It sounded better that way, more convincing, and more as though it might really come off. Canady even swung into the saddle, believing his own advice, and telling himself what he wanted to know, and then accepting it as a very good chance indeed. Again, it was his way. The man didn't live by the gun and a good fast horse without acquiring the working philosophy of works of elasticity and limit. Move on, he repeated to the horse. It's your part to get us across that flat in time. The little Mustang humped its back and shook itself like a wet dog. Running sweat and caked as well flew from its streaked sides. It gathered itself in response to the rider's words. That's a visible thing. The horse was like the man. It wouldn't quit short of the last second or step or shot. They were a kind of country around them. It was all the edge they had ever needed. Canady panted, wiped the perspiration from his eyes, and stared upward again. Behind him, the little horse came on, unled, and the loops rained over the horse as to not trail and be stepped on. He followed the man like a dog, panting with him, struggling where he struggled, sliding where he slid, and lunging as he did, after each setback. They had made it nearly to the top of the fan of the fallen rock below, and leading into the opening of the side canyon. Another 4 or 5 minutes they would be clear of the climb. They would be off to the slide and safely into the notch in the high wall of the valley. They would be out of sight from the posse, and the posse still had not come into view of them on the rise back across the plain flat. Easy, hoss, said Canady. We're going to make it. Canady was wrong. 30 yards from the top, the Mustang put its slender long foreleg into a rock crevice and drew it back quickly. The movement set the sled moving and caught the leg and crushed it like a matchstick below the knee. When the horse had freed itself and was standing hunched and trembling behind Canady, the shattered leg hung sickeningly, swing-like and free from the ground, and Canady cursed with tears in his eyes. It was not the luck of it that brought his angry words, but the shame of it. It was his pity and his feeling for a gallant companion that had given its all and almost found it through. The hesitation, the wait near the top of the sled, near the safety of the hole in the wall, it was a natural thing in the western man. His horse was hurt, and it was hopelessly hurt. He would have to leave it, but not like that. Not standing there on 3 legs hunched up like a metal pain and fright. Not standing there watching him with those liquid brown eyes. No, he couldn't leave his horse like that. But how else? He couldn't shoot the Mustang, for the noise would key the posse to his location. He had a knife, and he could cut its throat. Or he had an axe, and he could have crushed his skull above the eye socket and put the poor devil down painlessly. With a brock he might be able to stun the brave little brute, but he could not be sure of killing it cleanly. Same held true for the butt of his Colt, or the steel-shot heel of his Winchester. He could stun the horse, likely put it to its knees, but not still be able to go down knowing it would recover and not try to get up again and go on. And so suffer as no horse-riding man could think to let his mount suffer. But damn, this was his life and he was arguing with about. It wasn't the damn horse's life. If he didn't do something and do it quick, the posse would be over the rise and the horse would go to hell together. Well, he could use the Colt butt. He knew he could hit the exhausted animal hard enough to put it without the necessary time for himself to get onto the hole in the wall, and for the posse to ride up and on the valley. That was all the time he needed, or at least it was all he could ask for. He pulled the Colt and started back to the horse, sliding and stumbling in his hurry to get to the trembling beast and knock it down. But when he got up to its side, when he looked into those dark eyes, he couldn't do it. He had to be sure. The hell with the posse, he said to the little horse, spun the Colt in the air and caught it by the handle and put it right behind the ragged ear and pulled the trigger. The smoke from the shot was still curling, and the little pony was still going down slowly, when the first of the pursuing riders came up over the rise across the flat and yelled excitedly back to his comrades that the game was in sight, and on foot. Canady went up the little stream behind it, where it fed rainbow falls leaping outward into the main valley, and the policemen were just topping the Demetrius flat and closing in on the hole. Back there, Canady made a decision. It was not to stay and fight from the entrance cleft to the hole, where the little rivulet went out to the side canyon. He did not know what lay up on the side canyon, and feared he might be a way to get which the possemen, familiar with the territory, would ride a circle and come in behind him. He could not risk that, he believed. He must go up the creek as far as he could, hoping it would be far enough to find a place where he could put his back to the wall and fight without their being able to get behind him. Now, going along, the way was becoming steeper and narrower, the creek bank is little more than wide enough to pass a good horse and rider. He saw ahead of him a basalt dike, or cross dam of rock, which cut across the narrow floor of the side canyon. There was a stream with another plunge, and this was about 30 feet. Above the dike, Canady could see the boles of pine trees, and knew since the ground above they disliked, though fairly level, the crust laying in the rock apparently served as a barrier against which the winter erosions of snow, ice, and thaw had worked into the spring floodings to the creek down to the soil, and built up a tiny flat. Kennedy's gray eyes lit up, his brown face relaxed, and he said aloud, "Ah, God, maybe this is it," and went on with renewed strength and some hope of keeping his life a little longer. Up there, above the rock cross bank, a man with a good carbine and plenty of shells could hold down an 8-man posse for several afternoons. Well, 2 or 3 anyway. For one, for certain until nightfall. 12, 15 hours, say. It was better than nothing. His luck held. There was a good angling trail along the 30-foot vertical face of the rock. And it was a game trail, and somewhat of a cow trail, too. He made out the droppings of elk, black-tailed deer, and steer ranges, then suddenly and strangely, a fairly fresh pile of horse sign. This latter had sent a chill through him. He was on his knees in an instant, sighting. Then he straight grinned, grinding, and that was all right. The pony was unshod. Moreover, he suspected that the hard prints in the ground the left over had been shod was one of a bunch of broomtails, wild stallions, came into this rocky depth of water that flowed so green and cool in the stream. Clearing the top of the stone dam, Canady grinned wide. The flat above lay precisely as he had imagined it. He laughed softly, as a man will do when he's alone. Now then, it would be a little different from the place those hungry lawmen had passed it. It was perfect. At the apex of the triangle of the flat saw a thick stand of sycamore and cottonwood tree, aspen, laurel, and willow, and he knew that the water was headed there. A moment later he made out the source of the stream, a large artesian spring gushing from a native rock under the grand pressure. The spring was set above the grove some few feet, its stream falling rapidly to plunge into the foliage. Likely it cooled up under the trees, and probably down to Johnsburg. That's what lured the wild horses and the other game, and the cattle, too. What few of the latter were hardly enough to come this far into the mountains for feed. All a man would need to know was hole up in these boulders that girded the spring, and there above the trees, and he could command his Winchester the whole of small and open flat plains of Spring Grove and the stone cross dam that Canady had just clambered up. Taking a deep breath, the fugitive started across the flats toward the spring and its hole-up boulders. It was not until he had climbed safely into his haven at the canyon head and laid down panting that he looked back at his trail, and there were already a few possemen, and he saw that they had come. Below him, in the trees, the spring pooled up exactly as he had expected it would. Also, the rim of the pool showed the centuries of wear from the hoofed animals coming to its bank for water. There was something else, 2 other things, that he had not expected to see there, and the grin faded, and his gray eyes grew taut and tired and empty. The first thing was a wild horse. It had not gone up and out of the side canyon as Canady had hoped, showing him the way to follow its tracks and escape over the rim where no mounted man might follow. It was still in the grove of trees that sheltered the spring pool waterhole, and it wasn't still there because of its thirst. Beyond the trees, back where Canady had come from, and so skillfully blended and built into the natural cover of the canyon that even his range-wise eyes had missed them, there were 2 woven brush and pole wings of a second thing Canady had not dreamed to find there. Those were man-made wings of a mustang corral down there. Canady had stumbled into a horse trap, and was caught there now, with this unfortunate lone mustang that now cowered in the trees and could not get out of the trap any more than he could, and for the same reason, the posse and the box canyon. "Steady on," Canady called softly down to the terrified horse. "We'll think of something." 2 hours after high noon the sun had gone from the canyon, and Canady could see its light splashing the far side of the main valley still, but the canyon was soft-shaved and hot. Kennedy drank enough water to keep himself from drying out, yet not enough to log him. He noted the wild mustang seemed to do the same. It knew, as Kennedy knew, to be ready for a fight or fly when an empty belly. Smart, said Kennedy. Smart as hell. The horse heard him and looked up. Coo-ee, coo-ee, Kennedy called him reassuringly. Don't fret, I figure something for us. But it was a lie, and he knew it was a lie. He had gone down right after the first layup on the spring boulders and saw the trap and the wild broomtail in it. He closed off the narrow gate with a funnel-winged growl with his lariat, as he had done that in a hurry before the posse had worked up to the canyon and taken its position on top of the cross dam. His one thought had been that the broomtail was a horse, wild or not, and so long as a man had a horse, he wasn't out of it in that country. And he waited to keep hidden from the posse and the fact that he did have a horse up there in the head timbers water. The mustang had played with him in the last part of it, lying up shy and quiet as a deer in the bushes and brush, not wanting any more Canady warning for men who knew where it was there. It, in this case, was a scrubby little stallion, probably too old to hold a band of admirers. The little horse had only the fixtures of the temperament of a mongrel stud animal. Watching him lie still in the spring brush, his eyes following every move of the men below him, as well as the single man above him, Canady knew that he and the trapped horse were friends. The only problem was proving it to the horse. Sometimes these old scrub studs had been ridden long ago and would remember a man's smell and voice. He tried dozens of times to talk to the mustang up towards his end of the spring pool, but the animal gave no sign that his sense and sound mankind was familiar with him or welcome. He bared his teeth silently and pinned his ears and squatted on his haunches ready to kick like a pack mule in the morning. He did this every time Canady said more than 3 or 4 words to him, or accompanied his talk with any movement that he might mean that he was coming to see the horse, if the horse would not come up to see him. What possible good the horse could do him, even if by some miracle Canady might gentle him down and put his saddle and bridle on him, Canady didn't know. Then, even when he was thinking that far, he laughed and shrugged. His saddle and bridle were down there on that rock below the hole in the wall, and he'd had no time or reason to take them off his dead mount. So if he went out there and tied the broomtail, it would be bareback, and that was about as good as bad as the old crafty stallion would sprout wings and fly up out of the canyon. The bridle, of sorts, he could rig from splitting and unraveling short length of his lariat. It would be sort of breakage hackmore arrangement, and might have to do more simple directions of right and left and well up. But even if he rigged the Sioux headstall and got it on the shaggy little horse, then what? That was, even if the rascal wanted to be good, or had been ridden in the past, and remembered it all of a sudden, nothing. Not a damn thing. Canady couldn't ride out of that canyon if he had the best saddle mount in Montana waiting and eager to make him try. It was all crazy, thinking of that wild stud. But just finding any horse up there was bound to start a man's mind going, especially when he had just shot his own mount and was fixing to put his back on the best rock he could find and go down head flying. But it was crazy all the same. All Canady could do was to go up the old broomtail stud could do, bite the rope in the last breath till he had him, then kill himself, if he could, before the others did it for him. The afternoon wore on. The heat in the deep-walled little canyon was enormous. Deerflies swarmed up the shining pool and bit like mad cats. They nearly drove Canady wild, but he fought them with his hand and minded the swats of neck back. And when evening came, they lifted up out of the canyon on the first stir of the night wind. In the early part of the waiting there began some desultory talk between the posse and Canady. Talk of Canady coming out peacefully or getting a fair trial, but the fugitive had not bothered to take that offer seriously. He knew that the trial was he would get. The posse had its own witnesses with it. They would bring up these 2 or 3 men who said, seen the shooting, and say to them, "Is that him?" And the men would say, "Yes, that's him." And the trial would be over. The witnesses, like Canady, God, how he hated them. It wasn't that he minded being identified if he was the man. It's his business. No feeling was held against a witness who had seen something. It was those devils, like the ones in the posse, who had not seen the job, and yet were always ready to raise their right hands to be sworn, were the ones that Canady hated. There had been many witnesses that had passed between him and that teller. All the other bank people sat on the floor behind the cage, and there had been no customers in the bank or in front of it. The shooting had happened, and Canady had made it to his horse and back to the bank, and made it some way down the alley into the sagebrush south of town, before he had passed a living soul. Then it was two farm wagons, both carrying kids and driven by women, that he had ridden well out of Gray's Landing. How those good folks, and they were only real witnesses, saw the cashier and the other teller in the bank floor, how they could identify him as anything other than a horseman not of that area, Canady did not know. As for the 3 shots that had killed the teller, they must have killed him if the posse would not have pushed so hard. Those shots had been fired after both barrels of 36 Derringer and the teller brought up out of the cash drawer. He had been triggered and put 3 slugs, one in Kennedy's chest, and one in the ceiling of the Second National Bank of Gray's Landing, Montana. But the only witness to that fact was dead. Canady had reacted as all men with guns in their hands react to other men with guns in their hands. It had fired an instinct, pure conditioned reflex of long experience, when that first 36 bullet went into the pectoral muscles of his left chest. Armed robbery? Certainly. 20 years in territorial prison? Of course. The man expected that. He had been run down like a mad dog and cornered and starved out and strung up on a naked cottonwood like a damned Indian drunk or a common horse thief. That was not right or fair. Murder? Could you call it murder? When the other man was a professional in his business and he could see that you were professional in yours. And you told him he would be killed if he tried anything funny. Then when on top of the fair warning, you gave the first shot? You could call it murder if he shot the answer in his head and tried killing you. Self-defense was actual verdict, but, of course, an armed robber could not plead self-defense. But he was not guilty of murder, or even assault with a deadly weapon, or even intent to commit murder. Of all the damn thing, really. But to sack that calf drawer and clear out the Gray's Landing as fast and as peaceably as he as an old horse could manage. Canady grinned, even as he extorted himself. It was no good. He knew it was no good. A man had to be honest with himself. If he was another business, he wouldn't have needed a gun to conduct his trade. Needing and using a gun, till he was always in peril being forced to use it, the teller was an honest man. Frank Canady was a crook. The teller was a dead honest man, and Canady a live dishonest man. Canady was a killer. "No," he yelled down at the posse. "I won't do it. I won't shot second. I didn't mean to harm the fellow. He pulled on me and shot first. He's dead, ain't he? Sure he is. And you say to me you come to down peaceful and you'll just get me a fair trial? With a dead teller back on the floor of the Second National? That's rich. Really rich." The posse men were startled. It had been 2 hours since the fugitive had made a sound. Previously he had refused to come down, and they had thought he meant it. Now, did they detect a change? Was it that he wanted to reconsider and was only protecting his ego by the defiant outburst? What was that all about? "That's right, you heard us," the leader of the posse called up to him. "You come down here and we'll guarantee to take you back to Gray's Landing and get you either in Cheyenne or Miles City, wherever the court's sitting, by train and under armed guard. You'll get the trial we promised and the protection beforehand." He waited a significant moment, then demanded, "What'd you say? There's no use any more people getting hurt." Kennedy's gray eyes grew tired again. "That's so," he called back. "It includes me, too. I don't want to see nobody get it else, either. Especially me. No thanks, Mr. Posse Man. I'll stay up here. I don't fancy what we brung all them ropes just to tie me up and ride me back to Gray's Landing." There was a silence from below the cross stand in the rock, in the upper throat of the canyon, that lasted perhaps 2 or 3 stretching minutes. Then the posse man called back. "All right," he said. "You'll have it your way. When it's full dark, we're going to come for you, and you know what that'll mean. There are 8 of us, all good shots, but you won't have a chance to rat a note bin. We've got bullseye lanterns on the boat to light you out." We get them up behind those boulders where you can't snipe them, and yet where they bright throw light up there around you, you might like a bright moonlight. We mean to stomp you out. There won't be no trial and no talk of a trial. You're dead right now." Canady sank behind his breastwork of basalt and gray-green granite. He hawked the company's spittle from his mouth and spat grimacingly down towards the Mustang stud. The animal had been crouching and listened to the exchange of voices intelligently, like some big, gaunt, sandy-maned dog. Seeing him and noting his apparent interest, Canady managed to trace a slight grin. "Well, what do you say, amigo?" he said. The horse looked up at him. It was the first time after long hours that Canady had seen the jungle tribe talking to the animal, and he had made a direct and not spooked response to the voice. Now he stomped his big leg and split-rocked forehoof, and whispered softly and grunted in his threats, precisely as Canada's old horse had done. "All right," said Canady, for some reason feeling mildly warned about the Mustang's action. "So I've reached one friend in the world. That isn't too bad. As long as you have a friend, you have a chance. Rest easy. Let me think. We'll still make it. You and me." It was dusk when the old steer came down the cliff. There was also Ladino, one of those mossy horned old rascals that had suddenly hidden out in the old gathers of a dozen years. He was old and crafty and cautious as any steer animal, but he had to have water, and he was coming down to the spring pool to get it. He certainly saw the men on the posse and winding their mounts, but they did not see him, and he knew that they did not. His yellow buckskin hide and the dark crews, or cross stripes on his shoulders, and the dark brown legs and feet blended perfectly into the weathered face of the cliff, and he made no more sound coming down that hidden trail than a mountain doe might have made. But he had failed to see Canady, or at least separate his scents, or the scent of Mustang Stud, and the other horse and the man scenting from below. He came on carefully, silently, yet quickly down the wall of the canyon above the rim and above Canady, seeing him and suddenly lifting his head and heart. He had seen right in the first place. There was a trail up that blind box canyon of the side of the canyon. A track up the dizzy sheer cliff up there, that he could pass as a desperate man who would eat a cat-like wild mustang, but not a mounted man, or a man going afoot leading a tamed and saddled mount. Come on," he heard himself whispering to the old outlaw steer. "Come on down here and let me see how you do it. Let me see how and where you get off that damned wall and land down here where we are." He grinned when he said it. Then he said "we," meaning himself and the wild stud, without thinking about it. It was funny how a man can take anything for a friend when he had run out of real McCoy and was in his last corner. I suppose that if a sidewinder crawled up along that final minute, and he would have had to talk to it, the man would find some excuse to think friendly of the snake tribe. Well, anyway, he was thinking with his deep kindness about the animal kingdom just then, especially the horse and the cow part of it, and especially about the latter half. "Come on, keep coming on, don't slip, for God's sake," he said to the giant dun steer. "Easy, easy, let me see you do it. Just don't fall and spook or get a bad smell and change your mind. That's it, easy, easy." He topped the steer down that cliff as though his life depended on it, and it did, and the steer made it. He made it in a way that caused Canady to suck in his breath and shake his head in wonderment. He made it in a way that even caused Canady to think for a moment about being there some other idea of divine providence, but it was the sort of thing no man could have figured out by himself. That weird, crazy, wonderful kind of last second reprieve that no force of God Almighty could have sent a man in Canady's place. It was a miracle. The Don Steer performed it with an easy quickness that defied belief, too. He came to that place on his side of the canyon where it seemed to Canady that the trail must end. The man could see the sheer face of the rock dropping 60 feet in that crack bed. A giant outcropping of granite hid the exact end of this right side trail, but Canady could see it. And with absolute certainty the trail did not continue downward from that outcrop that hid its actual terminus. But as he watched the steer disappear behind the outcrop, and as he wondered what would happen next, he saw the lean yellow body lurch itself in a graceful step from behind the outer ledge of the outcrop, and sail outward through the thin air of the canyon's drink throat. It appeared as though the leap would stash 50 brute nor would he brute through the rearing face of the opposite end of the left-hand canyon, which lay no more than 15 or 20 feet from the right side wall. But the steer disappeared, this time seemingly into the very face of the opposing cliff. There was a tricky turn in that rock of the canyon side, just at the point. However, and while Canady could see the creek's raggedy broken bottom, he could not see where the steer hit into the wall. And he was sure for the moment that the animal had made his landing somewhere other than the creek bottom. Difficult as it might be to accept, the old outlaw steer had somehow made it from one side of the wall to the other. But even so, then what? Where was he now? The question was sooner answered when the missing steer appeared and walked right out of the waterfall that came down the Kennedy's elevated vantage to strike into the begin following the brief section of creek down to the pool grove. While Canady gaped, the animal stole swiftly into the pool, drank sparingly, and returned, and disappeared again behind the curtain of misty water cascading down the spring above. So that was it, as simple and as remarkable as that. The trail ran from behind the waterfall up the left-hand wall, at the point opposite the right trail's send, to terminate. But in the obvious, there was more than enough for a run and jump in the opposite safe landing, two in front of either wall, with both takeoff and landing spots completely masked by the lower canyon. Gauging the distance of the jump, Kennedy knew he could make it, with his boots off and waist to his neck, or better, thrown over the colt in the saddle, and with the money. The Winchester being slung on his back, alone. He could make that distance in the air, but then, what of it? He made the jump safely and went out to the right side cliff trail, and the Tino steer and gained the rim. Then what? He'd still be afoot in the hostile land in midsummer's blazing heat without food, water, or a mount. That was the rub. Even if he made that jump and the cliff beyond, he got to the rim, he would have to have a horse. Otherwise, the posse men, within an hour or two of dark, having come for him and found him gone, would climb back out and climb the main valley in search for the sign of his arms on both sides of the canyon, and they would still get him. They would get him easy, with them mounted and him afoot. No, he had to take that broomy stud horse with him. Somehow he had to get that Mustang to go with him up the cliff. If he could do that, if he could get a little horse to make the jump with him on its back, it would have to be that way, and he could never trust the brute to follow him, or to wait for him if he allowed it to jump first. If he could make that gap in the canyon, back of the little wild horse, and then stay with him, headlanding him up the cliff trail, and then, my dear, would make it. He and the horse would make it together, just as he had promised to ranch the little devil. Up on the rim, he could remount the wiry Mustang, and together they would race away, and Canady would have his life, and the broomtail stud would have his freedom, and the Gary's posse would have their ropes unstretched and their vengeance unadministered, and left to God where it belonged. The thought of the Almighty came very strong to Canady, and in that moment in desperate hope. He turned his face upward to peer out of the narrow slit of lake twilight far below and far above him, where the walls of the canyon seemed almost to touch at the top, and where far, far up there he could just now see the yellow steer climbing up the last few steps of the steep trail, and helping himself for the run and losing himself in the canyon's view. Canady nodded and said to the dusk-hushed stillness about him, "If you let me make it too, Lord, me and that little horse down yonder, Lord, the bank don't need it, and I don't want it any more after this night. I will give this money to the widow or that poor teller. I will figure out some way to do it. Lord, she don't know where it came from, and it'll turn loose this little wild hoss. If you'll let me gentle him enough to get him and push him to the top over yonder, I'm going to try it, Lord. I'm going to go down there to that pool and try putting my loop around him. You reckon you could help me? I surely hope so, as I think you wouldn't send that Ladino steer down here to show a man a way out, and then not help him make it. Nor likewise do I think that you would put that little Mustang stud horse down here in that trap by the pool, unless you wanted him used. It looks to me, Lord, as if you truly wanted to pull me out of this here trap, and it's that way, Liz. Now thank you. I'll do my best." In the little light remaining, Canady went down from his rocks by the spring to try for the trapped wild horse. He took his rope from the trap gate and closed the gate. Instead, with brush and poles, hoping it would turn to the stud, though he could break past him when he came to the lariat. The actual catching went, as such things perversely will, with strange easiness. Or, the little horse fought the loop when he felt it settle on him, but he did not do so viciously. The very fact that he permitted Canady to come close enough to tap the loop on him to begin with was particularly simple. It made the matter suspicious to Canady, and he thought the little stud was merely stalling on him, as an attempt to get in close where he could use his teeth and consume on him. He knew a small Mustang would do this. They would fight like panthers in close, using their teeth like carnivorous animals, and their feet with all the savagery of elk and moose fighting off wolves. But this was not the case with his tattered broomtail in the Mustang trap. When Kennedy got up near enough to him, he saw the reason why, or thought he did. The telltale white marks of a cinch in the saddle, the places where white hair had grown in to replace the original claybank sorrel hairs, clearly showed the darkening twilight. Kennedy's first thought was that this horse had been handled before it was now assured, and it would certainly explain the change of the animal the moment the man snubbed a little tighter on his neck and under the jaw, in a way that showed the horse he meant to hold him hard and ride, and to handle him again and had been handled before years before. Memory is a strong force. The stud made Kennedy throw him on the ground, using a loose end of a rope, and make a figure-8 snake and rolled around his front legs to bring up the little pony down. But once he had been thrown and permitted to stand up again, it was all over. This man had gentled many horses. He had spent his life with them. Her smell had become his smell. The very sound of his voice had a horse sound in it. The Mustang had heard it in the man's first words. He had a sense of kinship with this particular man, and he had sensed his mastery of horsekind now. He submitted to Canady and stood quiet, but still trembling, while the man stroked him and sweet whispered to him, and got him to ease and stand without shaking, and without dread or apprehension. Then Canady cut and wove a makeshift brake and halter, the Plains Indian simple rope rein and bridle arrangement, continuing to talk all the while to the small Mustang. In half an hour more, it was full dark, and the splitter of a Hacklemore bridle and the short reining rope was finished and put upon the horse. The animal was used to all practical purposes. It was a usable saddle horse. There was a piece of the greatest luck Kennedy knew that he had been able to catch and work a little brute, but it was not so entirely luck as it had no sense of possibility to do it. The success made the fugitive believe that his hunch of higher help was a true one, and this thought in turn strengthened him and made his spirits rise. "Come on," he murmured to the little horse. "It's time we got out of here. Come on. Quick, quick. Yes. That's good. That's real good. Easy, easy." They went behind the creek falls, as the yellow Ladino steer had done. The Mustang pulled back a bit at the water, but once it had hit him, he steadied down and followed Kennedy's urging on the lariats, as well as obediently as any horse would have done in similar straits. Behind the chute of the falls, the left-hand trail went sharply up, but safely upward, and around the trunk-like bulge of the canyon's walls which had hidden from Kennedy's view in the spring. Around the turn was expected straight run and the leap over. This was better, even than Kennedy had hoped. There was actual soil in its track, and here and there some clumps of tough rough grass was giving footing, power for the jump. "Steady now," said Kennedy, and eased up upon the crouching Mustang. The little mount flinched and deepened his crouch, but he did not break. Kennedy sighed gratefully and nodded upward to that power which clearly was helping him now. He took his grip of the rope rein and put the pressure on his bowed knees to the Mustang's ribs. Beneath him, he felt the little horse squat and gather himself. Then he touched him, just touched him, with the left boot heel. The wild stud uncoiled his tense muscles and shot down the runway of the trail and came up to the jump across as though he had been trained to do it since childhood. Kennedy felt his heart soar with the mighty upward spring of the small brute's wiry limbs. He laughed with sheer joy of it. He couldn't help it. He never had in his life felt a triumph of such as this one, sailing over that hell's pit of blackness down there beneath him. This gliding spirit, this arching, floating burst of power that was carrying him high above those deadly rock fangs so far below, and was carrying him, too, up and away from those blood-hungry posse men and their winking, glaring, prying bull's-eye lanterns, which he could just see come now, from an eye corner, coming into view of the down canyon is a deserted place at the spring above the pool and the peaceful grove of mountain ash and water willow there at the head of the Rainbow Creek and Blunt Canyon. 60 or more miles from the Second National Bank, and that fool of a dead teller in Gray's Landing, Montana. Oh, what wondrous heady thing was life, and oh, what a beholden and humble man was Frank Canady for this gift, this chance, this answer to his fumbling prayer. He would never forget it. Never, never, never. They came down hard at the far end of the jump. The concussion of the horse hitting the ground rattled Kennedy's teeth and cracked his jaw together as loud as a pistol shot. He saw the lights behind his eyes and heard wild and strange sounds, but only for a second or two. Then all was clear again, and he and the little horse were going together up the right side of the cliff trail, Kennedy leading the way, and the little horse following faithfully as a pet dog behind him. It seemed to no more than a minute before they were where it had taken the yellow steer half an hour to climb, but it seemed only a breath later that they had topped over the rim and were free. Canady cried. The tears came down his face, and he could not help himself. He tried to think that little Mustang would care, though he was right. When he put his arm around the shaggy, warm neck and hugged the skinny old stud, the Mustang only whiskered deep with his throat and leaned into Frank Cassidy and rested his homely jughead over the man's shoulder. They were kind. They belonged to each other and were with each other, and that was true, for that was the way the possemen found them when they came probing carefully up the bed of the creek from the deserted pool to the fall of the waterfall. The horse had fallen, with the man beneath him, and neither had known the flash or spark or hint of thoughts in the instant their lives had been crushed among the granite stags, and the creek bed below the jumping place of the Yale that he noticed here.